Hello and welcome to the staff discussion for Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James as part of our Black Lives Matter discussion series. Let's start by really quickly introducing ourselves. My name is Marissa and I work in the outreach department and I will be facilitating today.
My name is Jacob and I'm also a member of the outreach department at Ann Arbor District Library.
I'm Emily. I'm a librarian here at Ann Arbor District Library. I purchase for youth fiction, but I mostly do events for adults.
And I'm Christopher. Sorry, Lucy.
No, you go ahead.
I'm Christopher and I work in youth, telling stories and doing a lot of events.
I'm Lucy and I also work in youth, telling stories and doing events for adults and kids.
And just like Christopher and Lucy, I'm Alex and I work in our youth department doing stories and events.
My name's Audrey and I am a librarian at the Ann Arbor District Library, and I work on our art prints and tools collections and do some adult events.
So Black Leopard Red Wolf is a long novel. It's a 2019 fantasy-ish novel written by the Jamaican writer Marlon James. It's the first book of his Dark Star trilogy, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction in 2019. And most recently, Michael B. Jordan purchased the rights to do a film adaptation of some kind. So we'll see what happens with that. So it came out to some rave reviews, but I really struggled reading this book, and I know people here did too. So I wanted to get that out in the open. So my first question is, how did you experience the book, and what did you struggle with?
I think one thing I also struggled, and to be honest, the only way I could get through it was I listened and read it like on a Kindle, so that they synced up, my ebook and otherwise I never would have finished it. But I had trouble like feeling like I could get my claws into any story arc. I feel like something would start and I'd be like, okay, I'm there, and then nope, I was gone. Or like with a character, they'd be doing something and then another character would interrupt and it wasn't always clear to me. So I was frustrated by those experiences.
I read it the exact same way, Lucy. I started out just reading the book because I'm generally not an audiobook person. And I was having a really hard time because there's a lot of dialogue where it doesn't attribute, it just goes from one person to the next. And if you lose track, you have to go back many, many pages and then count to figure out where you left off. So when I started listening to the audiobook, that helped a lot because the narrator did use a lot of voices. But I found when I was just listening to the audiobook, I would get confused by something. I'd be thinking about trying to figure out, wait, what was that? And then I'd miss what was coming next. So what I ended up doing for about the last quarter of the book was I felt like I was back in kindergarten and I listened to the audiobook and I read the book at the same time so that I could pause and look back. And I did enjoy the end of the book more than I enjoyed the beginning, but that makes for a longer reading experience and something that as an adult is a lot harder to find time for.
Yes, it was a matter of finding the time, and I think the word I would use is I wasn't able to buy in to the book because I didn't have the time, the patience, or the self-confidence, really. I felt that because I wasn't able to understand exactly what was going on, I would be miffed. And I would go, well, I don't even want to, I don't even, and I think that if I was able to give it the attention and mental energy necessary to really consume the book, I would have loved it. I'm just not at that place right now on this very day. So I hope that at one point this book comes back in my life and I'm able to give it the attention that it deserves. I also think that it is like something I have never read. And because I'm not able, my mind isn't able to go, oh, this reminds me of this other thing, or I know what's going on here because I read something similar in another book before. It is completely new to me. Well, it's also non-chronological. There's lots of different reasons. But yes, I gotta zip it.
I think like everyone, I had a hard time with reading the book. I was reading it just like in print format. And I had a hard time with like the kind of constant violence and a lot of the subject matter that kept coming up. I really feel like it was a little bit like listening to someone recount like a night terror they had where you don't have any of the emotional investment of your own dream. You're just like listening to someone else talk about their dream, and it had those same sort of like leaps of logic where suddenly something else is happening. So I found it to be kind of exhausting because I kept constantly having to go back and like try and figure out like, how did we get into this new place? Who is talking? And I feel like every time you would start to feel momentum, it would get interrupted, which was really frustrating. I mostly found it to be a really like frustrating experience for those reasons. It felt a lot like throwing yourself against a wall repeatedly, I feel like, where you would just keep trying to like read it and then like hit a wall, and then you would just keep like over and over again. And that's how it felt to me.
It's really validating to hear you guys say all that stuff, especially night terror, because like I had a hard time until it just dawned on me like, oh, like at least the first quarter of this book is just a straight up fever dream, doing exactly what you said. Just like it's making sense, and all of a sudden something else clicks into place and you're doing something very different. But like thinking of it like a dream made me give up on trying to make it make sense to a certain degree, which I think made it easier to follow through. And yeah, the subject matter is definitely challenging, unpleasant. Like every third page, there's just this horrific stuff that happens. But the world creation is so incredible. You know, he's drawing from so many different sources of African mythology and folklore, and his own imagination. And there's something, I think, really beautiful about the world he's created there, even if it's inhabited by some deeply shady people.
Yeah, at its best, this book seems to be, for me, it made me think of Don Quixote, or I told Lucy maybe Scheherazade. So the world building is interesting. It also honestly reminded me of, in parts, a really good D&D adventure. You've got Ghost Girl and Giraffe Boy and all these colorful characters going up against these colorful villains. But Audrey, something you said made me realize why I struggled so much with sexualized violence in it. It's because it's related so clinically and so dryly, and it's so horrific. We've probably all read upsetting, horrible things in books, but there's a sense of humanity as you're trying to relate to someone. And this just seemed so ritualized. That was why I think it was so hard for me.
That part bizarrely reminded, because I read a lot about the background of the book, and like one of the things he was inspired by was like Tolkien's like setting the bar for like fantasy writing. And so it made me think of that, and how like Tolkien does a lot of like the same thing, but it's like lineages. Like this almost felt like listing out a lineage of of different violences, which is like, it's like a very oral tradition thing. But and also like, I think it indicated how like the character was like numb to violence in a way, because it is very just like mundane for that character. But like, I just still had a really hard time with it. I feel like the violence was so extreme. I wanted it to do more than I feel like it did.
Yeah, I am like hearing you say this, both of you, Christopher and Audrey, that I was definitely bothered by the violence, and also like and the repetitiveness of it, and even in each scene, like, you know, not just a description of this thing that happened, but each detail. And yet at the same time, I could never, in like any of the action scenes, violence aside, I was never fully brought there. Like I felt like Marlon James could see what he was talking about and could see what he was writing about. I never could. In any of the scenes where there was action or fighting or anything, I couldn't envision it. And I think that made it difficult too to grab onto.
Yeah, I think that the violence and the structure kind of work in tandem almost. Of there's a part at the end where like they finally are coming up and meeting the boy, and then they're fighting, and then it was like, wait, what happened? Where are they? Where are we? And like feeling a little dislocated. Is that a word? Kind of. But I wanted to also say, so there was an interview with him that I read, which was interesting about violence. And he said, I think violence should be violent. There's nothing tasteful or beautifully written or wonderfully wrought about violence in real life, which is true. But I also felt like the characters felt somewhat two-dimensional to me, and sort of like the constant onslaught of violence, it felt meaningless to me. It's like, okay, the character loses an arm, and this happens, and this guy's dead, and like it felt very quickly meaningless. I don't know if anybody else felt like that, or
Absolutely.
in that case, like why make it so violent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like his aspiration is really good. You know, there's nothing glamorous about violence. Like the closer you are to it, the more obvious it's not in any sort of way. But I feel like this book has sort of like Kill Bill vibes. You know,
Mhm.
it was interesting to engage with something where like the central character is queer and male, and it's still like this incredibly hyper masculine, extraordinarily violent. I mean, there's just blood flying all over the place every single minute, you know? It's horrific stuff I'd never even dreamed of being a thing that could happen to a person, just like literally like almost every other page. And it's an interesting ride, but yeah, I don't think he quite hit the bar he set for himself there.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like he almost made it feel mundane in a way, which feels like it cheapened it rather than like making it like you didn't feel the impact of almost any of the violence at all. And there were really horrible things happening that would be horrible to I would certainly think to witness, even if you witnessed violence frequently. Like there has to be some impact, and the way that he presented it, it just felt very like disconnected from any experience, which I think is also why it felt a little like fever dream-y, where like again, like you as the reader, just there wasn't a lot to hook into, so there was no investment on your part. So a lot of the emotional beats and all that stuff just like felt very unmoored.
In reading the book, I thought to myself, Tracker is a character who doesn't care about anything. And then I thought about like times I've tried to read literature, like I think about Lolita, and like the guy in that book is like a gnarly, gross dude. And like at the end of the book, I'm supposed to go like, oh, I learned something from being in his gnarly, gross head. Like I'm supposed to learn something. I don't know what I was supposed to learn when I read Lolita. I'll be straight up with you. And reading this, I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to learn from being inside of somebody's brain that doesn't care about anything. It's like, I know I'm supposed to be learning something. There's probably some big literature thing I'm supposed to pick up on. I'm not.
Yeah, you know,
And it's also it's a big ask.
Oh yeah, and if you think about it, he's telling this whole story to somebody else, right? This whole book is him talking to this inquisitor. So I don't know, maybe that's why it doesn't need to be like you keep forgetting that, and then you realize like, well, wait, this guy's also a really unreliable narrator. Like he's just telling, I don't know, which then makes it seem like, is the violence that important to him? Like, yes, because it's such a focus of all of his storytelling. Although I think the second book in this series is like the same exact, what I've heard is it's the same story. It's told
Yeah.
from the point of view of the Moon Witch, right?
The witch,
her name?
Sogalan.
Sogalan, yeah. So who knows?
Yeah,
It's
which
intriguing.
was
I kind of
just
want to talk to someone who's read the second book. I don't want to go there myself, but I would be curious to hear someone's experience with it, because that perspective sounds more interesting to me. But maybe it's just because I'm more interested in witches than fighters.
That's an interesting character.
Mhm.
It's that you chose, like, I don't know if any of you had to read if you ever had to took like a world lit course where they made you read the Sunjata, like the epic of Old Mali. Like that character's name is the same as the mythical founder's mother of the Malian Empire. And it's a classic work. It's like if you take any survey lit course, even remotely related to Africa, like that's one that they would put in front of you. It's sort of like putting, I don't know, like Merlin into a story that you're writing for like a fantasy book. Like it's like a pretty ambitious choice, you know, like you're associating yourself with like the most important oral tradition for a huge chunk of the whole world. Yeah, it would be interesting to see her perspective, because Tracker really is, it's not like he feels nothing. Like he feels anger quite easily. He's just hitting that same note over and over and over again in all of his relationships.
Yeah, and he really doesn't like women
which
at all.
And I wondered, because again, for me too, I thought this, knowing the second book follows a female character, like I'm intrigued, but also I have hesitation because of how women were written in this book. I don't know how everybody else felt about it, but they seem to be very background objects, things to just illustrate sexual violence, but not really have any emotional weight. There's even a part where someone sort of calls out Tracker, and he's, I forget exactly how it is, but he's saying, oh, this woman is a witch. And they say, oh, do you think all women are witches? So I read another interview where it sounded like that was only included because someone called out Marlon James and said, you don't write women well. And if that's him fixing it and making it more feminist, I don't necessarily trust that he can effectively write a novel from a woman's point of view.
That would explain why there are, like what you're saying, if someone called him out there, because there are like lines that occasional female characters will have that are like, disparaging men, or talking about like how there's one where like men and their cursed arrogance, you curse, you shit, you wail, you bet women, you bed women, but all you really do is take up space, and like, so it's almost like, but it's not, there's not enough like character behind that or anything. So it's almost like he put these lines in to be like, no, see, the women recognize, they can talk back. I don't know. It's just, there are occasionally these lines where these women would kind of like say something to speak out against men, but then it didn't go anywhere. So.
Yeah, I think there was a line, I think from Tracker, but I might have that confused, where they're meeting a woman who was a slave, and he says, well, women aren't here just to serve men, or something like that. And it felt very out of left field compared to how he's treating other women that he comes across.
Yeah, I think I was so caught in how gay men get a very similar treatment for the most part in this book. They're love interests and then adversaries, and everything about it is just really brutal and awful. And there's not a lot of dimension to any of the queer characters other than Tracker and Leopard, whatever his deal is. And I don't think it defends what he's done with this work, but like my assumption was he was doing some sort of like Charles Bukowski thing where like everything's awful, and just like look at the very bodily and often brutal nature of the world around us, and I don't know, sort of like shoving our face in it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up,
Weirdness.
No, go.
Nope.
I was just gonna bring up queerness in general in this book and ask how you felt about it and how you thought it was handled. It seems like James was trying to sort of separate sexuality from masculinity, that, you know, many of the stereotypes are that gay men are effeminate or something like that. And then here's this very hyper masculine, tracker, violent, angry man. But then at the same time, it's sort of tied up in this identity where they keep repeatedly describing him as having a woman inside of him that can't be cut out. So yeah, I don't know, how did everybody feel about all of this?
I watched an interview with him in which he was talking about how a lot of people felt as though the queer aspects of the book are in response to something contemporary. But really, with his vast research of ancient African myth, he found that there's a lot of same-sex, non-binary stuff, trans stuff, plural pronoun stuff that has existed for hundreds of years in ancient Africa, and that's why he included it in the book. So then when I heard him say that, I was like, I'm looking at it through 2022 queer American culture lens, and maybe that lens isn't, I don't know, maybe that's not the looking glass to look through to see what's going on in the book. But also, it also just felt like men having sex with men. It didn't feel queer, which makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably, it's a series of some of the ugliest depictions of queer love that I've ever seen. And yeah, the gay guys in that book, like, they are remarkably homophobic. You know, like actively participating in a straight man calling out some random dude because he's a passive partner, you know, and just like, so the ugliness of the straight world just like completely bleeding through these queer characters that as they're sort of hurling hate at each other. And I don't know. It's interesting to hear you talk about, like, you're talking about like, what is the appropriate context for queerness in this setting? And I kept bumping up against my own lack of knowledge in that way and a lot of others. And that's a really interesting way to look at it. It's hard to know when to like turn the relativism on and the relativism turn it back off again. But I feel pretty comfortable saying that it's not a particularly flattering portrait of you know, my just queer people, gay men. It's taking some of the most brutal aspects of what gay men do to each other and making that the entirety of the gay experience, you know, at least through Tracker's eyes. And I don't know, I just found it profoundly ugly.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way about the I thought about the like constant talk of like the woman inside him that like couldn't be cut out or whatever as like an interesting, like, I don't know, non-traditional way to think about gender, but like ultimately I feel like it got overshadowed by like a lot of the other stuff in the book. And also, I don't know what it was exactly, but that book is so like, it's a very masculine book. Sorry, just in the way it's like written and like the way that it, like the characters that matter are all men. Like I don't know how much of it's my own limitations, but there was like, it almost felt like it was like gesturing at a thing, but like not going as far as I wanted it to, or like maybe I lack the context, having not intensely researched African traditions, but like, I don't know. It didn't really resonate with me on that level either.
So
I think
go ahead.
I think in the same way that the violent imagery was woven through the whole book, sexual imagery was too. I mean, obviously there are a lot of sex acts that were described, but even in the way that, you know, the landscape was described, but it was all in a very violent way. Like I found myself reading things and being like, this makes me feel bad, this description of the land makes me feel bad. How, and then I would break down the language and be, oh, okay, so it's because this makes you think of this word normally. And I think that made even the parts of the book and the moments in relationships that could be tender weren't. And that was so frustrating, because when there seemed to be that you knew it wasn't going to stay nice and happy, because that's not the kind of book this is. But when you were hoping for those moments of joy, and then they would still be described in such a bad visceral way rather than like the good visceral way, was very, I was hoping for a respite.
Yeah, this felt like a very antagonistic book in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Like Jacob, I had the understanding that James was at least attempting to write a novel portraying queerness pre-Christian, pre-colonization. So I kind of had that in my brain, but I also know that Marlon James is from Jamaica and grew up in an extremely homophobic culture, was extremely afraid to come out. And so I feel like that still saturated the book and the relationships in a really profound way that weren't edited out, or maybe they were intentional of how things were, which I also think is like sort of impossible, because you're never going to completely erase your own context. But yeah, it was very violent. And even though I really liked the character of Mosi, he was maybe my favorite character, and they had kind of a meet cute, and then they, you know, like haters to lovers kind of thing. But like really, I almost found the relationship between Tracker and the leopard more interesting, because they're both queer and they both have a very charged relationship, and very like, where I think I read like half the book assuming that they were partners or were at least having sex with each other, and then I don't think that they were, but it almost felt like a more complex relationship in a lot of ways, but also still very like they would beat each other up and had all their own fights.
I mean, they're the title characters. So I think that you went into it thinking, all right, well, this is the Black Leopard, so this has got to be, and he was an important character, but I did expect that the relationship between the two to continue to move in the way that it did in the first book of the book. And yeah, I agree with you, Marissa. It just kind of fell flat.
Go ahead, Jacob. I was just going to say, I didn't really like the conflation of queerness with having sex with boys. I thought, I didn't know what I was supposed to take from that as a reader. You know, and again, are we looking at it through our modern view or another view? I just was confused, I guess. That's all.
And if this is a trilogy about perspective, right? And we're as readers, we're attempting to see from what angle are we meant to stand to view what's happening in the book. Maybe when in the second book, the Moon Witch sees the relationship in a way that makes more sense to us than makes sense to Tracker. But am I going to read that book to find that out? No. I don't know. This book is a kick in the throat, and it's supposed to be a kick in the throat. And I wasn't ready to be kicked in the throat.
There's this
Maybe one day I will.
like small part of me, though, I agree that it's a kick in the throat. A small part of me is like, maybe if I read it again, the book would get out of the way. You know what I mean? Like, I would get it, because I wouldn't be so focused on like who's who and who's talking. But then I think about, do I want to dive back into like that violence and that world, you know? And there are so many other books that I want to read besides this 600 pages again. But there's this weird part of me that's like, I feel like if I read it again, something would click. And then
Yeah.
maybe the second book would be something I wanted to pursue.
It reminded me of like, I don't know, Ulysses or like Moby Dick in a way, where if you just had the like time, like the time an academic has to just sit and study this book for years and years and years, maybe you would like come to understand it more and love it more, which also I think added an element of frustration to me, because like most people don't have that time, right? Like we have other books we want to read, we have lives, we have like relationships, like we just have so much stuff going on that like to have to like slog through something to get to like put all the pieces together, like I found it to be really frustrating. Like I wanted to like just like, I feel like art needs to be like needs to meet people where they are, and like you have to understand it to like get the message. And like what are you doing if you're obscuring your message behind all these layers of whatever? Like what are you doing? I got like very frustrated with this book. So like I don't know, like it just made me think like this is a book for like academics or people who like critically review books for their job and like have
Or
a lot.
someone on a desert island, and this is the only book they have. Because then like you'd have to read it over and over and over, and then I don't know.
Yeah.
I think if I knew someone wanted to read this book, I would tell them to read the Wikipedia page first, because it's not like the story is, we're not like, oh boy, I'm surprised by this plot development. And I spent so much of my time trying to figure out what was happening. Finally, before I went into the last section, I just went and read the whole page. So I knew what was going to be happening. And come to think of it, maybe that's why I at least got a little more out of reading the end of the book, because I was less trying to unravel and more just like letting it wash over me, with the narrator, who did a very good job. I wish I remembered what his name was now, but he did a wonderful job representing the different characters, which is particularly tricky when you have so many. But yeah, I think that if you almost need to hold hands with someone or with a Wikipedia page to get through this, and maybe you would get more.
This was definitely a book that I like a lot more in theory than I do in practice. I really, because we're doing this discussion and I looked into articles and other think pieces about it, and I read the Wikipedia page so I knew what the plot was, and looked at interviews with the author, like because of all of this context, I feel like I understand what he was trying to do and I can appreciate it more. Whereas I did not enjoy reading this book itself, like the act of reading it, not enjoyable, but everything around it is cool. So it definitely felt like a theory book for me. Whereas if I'm thinking in my own personal time, do I want to read the sequel? Probably not. Which leads me to, I think we haven't really talked at all about the plot. For a 600-page book. Yeah, how did you feel about it? What happened in this book?
Why was it important to find the boy?
Was that ever answered? I mean, I feel like there were so many different reasons for why it was important to find the boy, to many different people, and who the boy was and what the boy had done. And I'm if that was answered, maybe I missed it.
Was he an heir? I feel like that was a piece of it. Should have been the heir rather than the king's sister. And this is just it. Yeah. If there are 7 of us who you would think are as close as non-professional professional readers could be, and we're all struggling. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote that comes pretty late in the book, that I felt like summed it up, where it said, "There is no straight line between us and this boy, only streams leading to streams, leading to streams, leading to streams. And sometimes, tell me if I lie, you get so lost in the stream that the boy fades, and with him the reason you search for him."
That's like the whole book right there. I mean,
yeah.
This is why I didn't like this book.
Yeah, I feel like that the stream to stream to streams, it feels very reminiscent of oral storytelling, because that's kind of how we think of, like, you're telling a story and then, oh, I have to give you context for that, and then let me tell you about this, and then it's suddenly you're talking about your grandma for no reason.
Yeah.
So it felt sort of authentic for maybe how he was trying to build the story, but it was frustrating as a modern reader. And I don't have a lot of context of, like, the epics to know if it is successful or not.
It does read like an epic in that sort of way. Like if you think about the story of Odysseus, like why exactly did he have to go bouncing around the entire of the Mediterranean to get from, you know, modern day Turkey to modern day Greece? Because it's not, even for the Greeks, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't that far, you know. It's the fact that it doesn't make sense isn't necessarily essential. Like the story of Beowulf is so gnarly and complicated in ways that that wouldn't make sense for modern storytelling at all. So I had sort of assumed that that's what he was sort of shooting towards.
Are you all fantasy readers? Because I'll say I was surprised. I am not. And when I opened the book and saw a map on the first page and how big the book was, and I thought, oh gosh, what have I volunteered myself for? But as fantasy readers, how does this compare to some of the like strong things of the genre?
Like this compares more to mythology and epics. Like really the only context I have is like the Odyssey. I haven't read like the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff like that, but it felt more like that. It did not to me read like fantasy at all.
Yeah, I feel like it's misleading to call it fantasy in a way. Like it doesn't read like fantasy, and I appreciate what he was trying to do, like rooting fantasy in like a different tradition than like a Western one. Like I think that's really important and valuable, but it like particularly because he was obviously like drawing on like the oral traditions and the way that it meandered, it just didn't like, it didn't really feel like fantasy to me.
That sounds about right. I've been waiting this entire time for one of you to say the words Game of Thrones. It's like if there's anything that this compares to, like that would be it, and that's, you know, it lives up to its publicity in that sort of way.
I don't know. I didn't find it to be very similar to Game of Thrones at all.
My experience of it is similar. Maybe that's where I'm drawing from. You know, my experience with Game of Thrones is like, oh, this is such a beautiful, complicated, just incredibly interesting world that he's created, and oh, something terrible happens. I've got to set this book down for like at least a month to recover from it before I can pick it back up again. And then you pick it back up, and sure enough, he's just going to put you through the same process over and over and over again. But like,
I guess there are similarities, but
yeah,
Game of Thrones I found so much more readable. Like I read each of those books in like under 3 days, like each like a book per every 2 or 3 days, and this took me forever. And he's certainly trying to do like much more like complicated things like with his language and storytelling, but yeah, I don't know.
I will say that like you, Emily, when I turned the first page and saw that map, I thought, oh boy, here goes a high school kid's 640 page terrible D&D adventure. And it was better than I expected after looking at those first few pages. And I thought, oh, you know, all these cultures, all these names, different languages thrown in. So I felt like it was better than an adolescent fantasy book. And I think in some ways the dreamlike aspect of the storytelling helped elevate that, instead of they went through the jungle for 3 days and they were carrying a pick and rations and, you know, whatever. I felt like in some ways it was a little bit more, I guess, oddly adult than some fantasy that I have not enjoyed.
It is so funny you would say that, because it felt like when I was teaching and you would go around the room and you would say, what are you working on? And that one kid would sit you down for 45 minutes and tell you exactly what he's working on. And it doesn't make it very much sense, but you're just kind of in awe of like his imagination. And you have to just sit there and listen because it's like, this is important. And you marvel at their mind. I marvel at Marlon James' imagination. Like, that's wild that a person sat down and wrote this book. That's wild. But there's this thing, this was from the New Yorker review of the book. He had written not just an African fantasy novel, but an African fantasy novel that is literary and labyrinthine to an almost combative degree. It's like, whoa, there you go.
Because I do want to stand up for fantasy and be like, some of it's not good, but there's also literature that's not good, right? And like there are also beautiful, wonderful fantasy books, so that are very good. Like, oh no, I've just forgotten it, but there are like other books. I don't know. I just like, I didn't love it. And
Yeah,
I'll give it another chance. I'll give fantasy another chance.
Fantasy label off.
The only fantasy I really ever read is like middle grade fantasy or some YA fantasy. And I feel like I really like the middle grade fantasy that I read. I feel like the world building is really well done and you're kind of pulled into that world. And maybe it's because that's where I'm coming from. I feel like what I've read, they're doing with a lot fewer words. Like there was a lot of this book that I was reading that I was like, it took you a lot of words to say a thing. And I understand that that's like building the world and but from my perspective, having been like pulled into these middle, and it's a totally different, I mean, middle grades, you know, it's going to end on a high note yeah, just, I don't know. I like middle grade fantasy. For fantasy, that's what I'll stick with.
Which it's funny. So the last of these discussions that I facilitated was Akata Witch, which of course I can't help having these two books in my brain at the same time, where Akata Witch is like very G-rated and this is X-rated. They're so different, but there's some similarities of leopards and the magical village. And in this book, probably maybe the only time that I actually laughed out loud was because there's a part where they're basically saying it's that the prophecy of children saviors is ridiculous, and why should children go die for adult things? And it really tickled me because that's, of course, a lot of the plot of Akata Witch is these children. There's, they go and have to fight the evil wizard, and it's just funny how those things crop up when you read two things in a row. And I actually kind of read this book, something that helped me deal with the narrative structure, aside from the audiobook, which also helped tremendously to get through it, was kind of thinking of this book as a collection of short stories. And to me, a lot of the stories felt like horror, which is a genre that I really enjoy reading. Because this book has some really horrific things, not necessarily because of the violence. So I don't know if anybody else had any like favorite sections, but one of my favorite like really interesting scenes, or I don't know, sections, was when they're finally reaching Duolingo, and it's very clean and automated and doors are just opening, and it's, what's up with that? And then it's this truly horrific reveal that it's slaves trapped in the wall pulling strings, and like that is like a perfect short story that's horrific and gross and cool and weird, where I wish the whole book was interesting, but it was a very cool little mini story is how I was thinking of it. So I think my last question for the group, because I like horror and this had a lot of cool monsters in it, was if anybody had a favorite monster from the book.
So My favorite, I think my favorite passage in the book is the travel through the Darklands. Pretty much every monster in there is, I think, just really inventive. You know, even if he's drawing from like actual mythological creatures, which is, I've Googled my way through as I read, and it seems like he almost always was. But I think he did a good job making those vivid and like really body horror grotesque in a lot of ways. But also just the general environment of the Darklands, like this sort of dreamscape that he's wandering through, I think is really interesting. Like the thought that like, are those elephants, are they spirit elephants, or is it just the place has a memory of elephants? I thought that was a really nice little passage.
I really liked the Omoluzu. I think they were very cool. They were the ones that walk on ceilings like it's the ground, and they're just like forever going to be hunting your blood until they get you. And the only escape is just never be indoors under a ceiling. I just thought that was really neat, and I was hoping to see more of them.
Yeah, I wouldn't myself be able to think up all these different kinds of colorful monsters. And I think that's another place that the book kind of shines. You know, to me, they were new. Even if they had been based on something else, I wasn't familiar with that. And that also made it, I think, really helped with the colorful nature of the adventure.
I was just reading this other middle grade fantasy for a work thing, and Ipindulu showed up in it, the vampire firebird, and I was like, wait, whoa! It was just so interesting to have that monster appear in two such different books, but both were drawing on like African folklore. So I don't know.
I love a creature feature, so. Cool. Does anyone else have any final thoughts that you were waiting to be brought up? Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and everybody here for sharing their thoughts. I hope to see you next time when we are having a total change of pace. We're reading Indigo by Beverly Jenkins, which is a romance. So getting away from all of this, which will be a nice change of pace. So thank you and see you next time.